The signal came in at 3:17, which was always the hour when nothing good happened. Sergeant First Class Dario Voss was on his third cup of cold coffee when the proximity alarm lit up the forward observation post like a Christmas tree. He was 41 years old, 12 years into a career that had taken him from the ash fields outside Bogotá to the frozen ridgelands of the Caucasus, and he had learned long ago that the kind of alarm that blinked amber and red at the same time was the kind that preceded the sort of paperwork nobody wanted to file. He set down the cup. He did not reach for his sidearm. He pulled on his jacket instead, because the night air on the Azerbaijani plateau cut to the bone even in June, and walked to the sensor array. The readout made no sense. He stared at it for 40 seconds, tapping the screen twice to confirm it wasn't a software ghost, and then he stepped outside and looked up. They were already there. 3 ships, if ships was the right word for objects that hung in the atmosphere without any visible means of propulsion and pulsed with a faint blue-green light that made the underside of the clouds look like a reef seen from below. No sound, no exhaust trail, just presence, enormous and patient, the way a mountain is patient. Voss watched them for a long moment. Then he went back inside and filed the contact report. That was how it started, not with fire, not with the things all the movies had promised. It started with 3 lights over a Azerbaijani plateau and a sergeant who was tired enough to be calm about it. By the time the Joint Rapid Response Element arrived 18 hours later, the ships had descended to an altitude of approximately 200 meters above the valley floor and stopped moving entirely. The surrounding terrain had been evacuated of civilians, a process complicated by the fact that the nearest village had refused to leave on the grounds that the lights had been prophesied in a manuscript dated to the 14th century and were therefore a blessing. The UN coordinator had eventually bribed them with a substantial amount of emergency food aid, and the promise that the local council chairman would be photographed shaking hands with whatever came out of the ships, assuming whatever came out of the ships had hands. Dario Voss had been reassigned to the JRRE as a senior NCO, which meant he was now technically subordinate to a 28-year-old Canadian captain named Halois Tran, who had a doctorate in xenobiological contact theory and had never once been shot at. He liked her immediately. She reminded him of his younger sister, who was also alarmingly competent and similarly prone to approaching catastrophe with a clipboard. "They're not doing anything," Captain Tran said, studying the sensor feeds in the forward command tent. "No," Voss agreed. "They've been not doing anything for 18 hours. That's a lot of not doing anything." She turned to look at him. "You're not scared?" "I'm scared," he said. "I've just had a lot of practice at it." She smiled at that, something quick and involuntary. The consensus from the contact team is that they're waiting to be approached. The light pulses appear to follow a pattern consistent with deliberate signaling rather than mechanical process. They're saying hello. Or they're saying come closer so we can eat you. That's also a possibility. They were quiet for a moment. Outside the tent, the valley hummed with the distant machinery of soldiers doing what soldiers do when they have nothing to do: cleaning weapons, brewing tea, playing cards, sleeping in vehicles. Normal human noise under 3 blue-green lights that weren't from here. "Tomorrow morning," Tran said, "we make contact." The contact protocols that had been debated and revised over 40 years of theoretical xenobiology collapsed, in practice, to a single human reality. Somebody had to walk out there first. The UN committee had spent 16 hours on video conference arguing about who that person should be. They had produced a list of qualifications that would have taken most people a decade to accumulate. They had then discovered that the only person on the ground who met all the qualifications was Captain Tran, who was emphatically not going to be the one to walk out there because she was the operational commander, and also because she was 4 months pregnant, which she had disclosed to no one but Voss, who had figured it out from the particular way she drank her tea. So they sent Voss. He walked out toward the nearest ship on a Tuesday morning with the sun coming up behind him and casting his shadow long across the dry grass, carrying a small LED panel programmed to pulse a response to the ship's signals, and a flask of coffee because he had not yet had breakfast and he refused to potentially die on an empty stomach. The contact team watched from the perimeter. Captain Tran watched from the forward post. Overhead, 3 shapes the size of football stadiums hummed a note too low for human ears to fully register, only to be felt in the chest like a second heartbeat. He was 60 meters from the nearest ship when the ramp appeared. It descended from the ship's underside, which appeared to have no seam or hinge point. The surface of the ship simply resolved itself into an opening the way a cloud parts, without drama, without machinery. The ramp itself was the color of old pewter and caught the morning light in angles that suggested geometry Voss couldn't quite parse. He stopped walking. He waited. They came down 2 at a time. There were 8 of them in the first group. Bipedal, roughly human in proportion, but considerably taller. The shortest appeared to be close to 2 meters, and the posture was different, too upright, as though gravity was something they were politely accommodating rather than genuinely subject to. Their skin, where visible, had a quality that made Voss think of oil on water. Not a single color but many colors moving beneath a surface that appeared solid. Their faces were arranged around 4 eyes instead of 2, horizontally set, and the mouths were smaller than he expected, almost delicate. They wore garments that shifted with their movement in a way that made it hard to say where the garment ended and the body began. They stopped at the base of the ramp and did not approach him. He approached them. This felt important later when people asked him why he did it. He had no protocol for it. The protocol said to wait. But standing there in the morning light with the coffee flask in his hand, and 8 beings from another star system watching him with 4-eyed calm, Voss had felt something very human and very stubborn stir in him. He was not going to make them come to him. He was going to meet them in the middle. It was the only thing he knew how to do in any situation that mattered. He walked to within 5 meters and stopped. He held up the lead panel. He pulsed it, 3 short, 2 long, 3 short. The same pattern the ships had been transmitting. For 4 seconds, nothing happened. Then the being at the front of the group, slightly taller than the others, slightly more deliberate in movement, tilted its head in a way that was so reminiscent of a human gesture of consideration that Voss felt the hair stand up on his arms. It raised one hand, not a weapon, not a device. An open hand, oriented palm out like a pause or perhaps a greeting. He held up his own hand the same way. They stood like that for a moment and Voss thought, well, here we are. Language took 3 weeks. Not because the visitors, the Vailn, as they eventually made understood through an exhausting collaborative process of gesture and mathematics, and one memorable afternoon in which a Vailn linguist drew what appeared to be a phonetic map directly onto a whiteboard, while Captain Tran nearly vibrated out of her skin with excitement. Not because the Vailn were unwilling, but because the gap between their communication system and human language was profound enough that both sides kept discovering new ways to be completely wrong about what the other was saying. During those 3 weeks, Voss served as the primary human contact point, not because anyone had planned it that way, but because the Vailn, for reasons that became clearer later, had specifically requested his continued presence. He spent 12 hours a day in a temporary contact facility built at the base of the nearest ship, sitting across a surface that served as something between a table and a projection screen, working through concepts with a Vailn who introduced itself eventually as something that translated most accurately as Archivist of Second Threshold, though Tran shortened this to Arch for practical purposes. Arch was patient in a way that felt geological. When Voss made an error, and he made thousands, Arch would simply indicate the error through a small, precise gesture and offer the correction without any visible irritation. When Voss got something right, which happened more and more as the weeks passed. Arch would do something with its secondary set of eyes, a slight focusing inward, that Tran had begun to identify as the Vailn equivalent of a nod of approval. "You are the one they study," Arch said, on the day the translation finally became fluid enough for something like real conversation. The words came through an interface device that rendered Vailn phonics into something approximating spoken English. The voice was flat and without inflection, like a synthesizer version of calm. "What do you mean?" Voss said. "Before we descended, we watched your species for some time. This one is different. Your behaviors when first contact occurred. They were not like the others." "You've made contact before." "With other species?" "With many. The response pattern is known: fear, weapons deployment, territorial broadcast, or..." Arch paused, and Voss had begun to learn to read those pauses as something like careful word choice, complete withdrawal, hiding, pretending not to notice. "And I did neither." "You came closer," Arch said. "This was unexpected and of interest." Voss thought about that. "Where I come from," he said, "if something scares you bad enough, sometimes the only thing that helps is going toward it. You stop being afraid of exactly the thing in front of you and start working the problem instead." Arch was quiet for a moment that Tran, watching from the observation station, would later describe as the longest 4 seconds of her professional life. "This is a human concept," Arch said. "I suppose it is. We have no equivalent." The offer came on a Thursday, 6 weeks into formal contact. By this point, a joint human-Vailn communication team had established a working protocol, a rough shared lexicon of about 400 concepts, and a tentative framework for what the Vailn wanted, which was a great deal more than anyone had expected. The Vailn were old, older than human civilization by an interval that made the word old feel insufficient. They had been traveling between star systems for longer than humanity had been drawing on cave walls. In that time, they had encountered many species, cataloged many forms of intelligence, and developed what Arch described as a taxonomy of minds, a classification system for intelligent life organized around something that translated approximately as foundational nature, the core quality that defined how a species engaged with existence. Most species, Arch explained, fit known categories that the Vailn had established over millennia. Humans did not fit. "We have observed your species for 112 years of your measurement," Arch said. "We have not resolved the classification." Voss frowned. "What's so hard to classify?" Arch did the inward focus thing. "You are simultaneously the most destructive species we have ever documented and the only species we have encountered that appears to understand this about itself and to struggle against it. You build. You destroy the building. You mourn the destruction. You build again. This cycle," Arch paused, "it does not compute to any known foundational nature." "Maybe we're just contradictory." "Contradiction is a classification," Arch said. "But you are not simply contradictory. Your contradiction has direction. It moves. Other species with high destructive capacity have no concept of their own violence as loss. You have many words for this. You have art for this. You have," another pause, "music specifically composed to mourn the things you have destroyed." Voss thought about that for a long time. Then he said quietly, "Yeah, we do." It was on that afternoon that Arch introduced the offer. The Vailn had a practice, ancient, formalized over thousands of years of interspecies contact, for situations where a species remained unclassified after extended observation. It was called, in translation, the offering of paths. 2 representatives of the visiting species would be assigned to the unclassified species. These representatives were not ambassadors in the diplomatic sense. They were something closer to what Arch described as resonance keepers, beings specifically trained to understand and embody qualities that define the Vailn, selected for compatibility with whatever qualities had been observed in the species under study. The purpose was simple. The unclassified species representative would interact with the two pathkeepers and at a defined point indicate a preference. Not a romantic preference, Arch was careful to note, though Voss noticed that Tran, watching from the booth, had gone very still and was making small rapid notes. The preference was meant to indicate something more fundamental. Which quality, which mode of being, the human contact representative felt was more true to what humans were. The choice, Arch said, would inform the Vailn classification. The classification would determine how the Vailn interacted with humanity going forward. As allies, as study subjects, as something to avoid, or as something else entirely for which there was no human word but which Arch described, after a long search through the emerging shared lexicon, as kin. If I understand you correctly, Voss said slowly, you're telling me that what I choose between these two individuals is going to affect how your entire civilization relates to my entire species. This is correct, Arch said. Voss was quiet for a moment. That's a lot of weight for one person. You were selected, Arch said, because you are the one who came closer. They were brought forward the following morning. Voss had spent the night not sleeping. He had drunk approximately half a pot of coffee, stared at the ceiling of his billet, and had a conversation with Captain Tran that lasted until 2 in the morning and covered, without resolution, the full philosophical and practical weight of what he was facing. Tran had been thorough and brilliant and had ultimately said, I can't tell you what to choose, Sergeant. But I can tell you that whatever you choose needs to come from something true about you, because I think they'll know the difference. He had not asked her what she meant by that, because he already knew. The two pathkeepers descended from the ship together, and Voss registered them the way he registered all things in high-stress situations. Precisely, quickly, without initial judgment, storing detail for later processing. The first stood very still. She and the gendering was imprecise, but both the human and Vailn translation teams had agreed that human pronouns were the nearest available approximation, was taller than the others he had seen, and where the other Vailn had that oilon water quality to their coloration, hers was more settled, more singular. A deep, layered blue that made Voss think of ocean water in winter, of depth that went further down than light could reach. Her 4 eyes were dark and direct, and when she looked at him, he had the distinct sensation of being measured with an instrument of extraordinary precision. She did not smile. She radiated what Voss could only describe as certainty. She moved through the world as though she had already calculated all possible outcomes and found them manageable. Arch had provided a translated name. He had been told to call her Stillwater. The second was different. She was shorter for a Vailn, and her coloration was warmer, amber and copper, and something that flickered at the edges toward gold when the morning light caught it from certain angles. She walked with a quality that Voss, after a moment's thought, identified as attention. She was looking at everything, taking things in, turning her head toward sounds, letting small genuine reactions show in the movement of her secondary eyes. When she saw him, she did something he had not yet seen a Vailn do. She tilted her head in a direction that corresponded to no word in the shared lexicon, but that his human nervous system registered on a level below language as warmth. He was told to call her kindling light. They stood before him, the 3 of them, in the morning light on the plateau. Arch stood to one side at a respectful distance. Voss said, in the flat, careful English of the shared interface, I've been told you both understand more of our language than most. We were prepared, Stillwater said. Her translated voice was clean and even. I was curious, Kindling Light said. Her translated voice had variations in it, tiny inflections that the interface preserved. I learned more than preparation required. Voss nodded. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced 2 things. One was the LED signal panel, now worn at the edges from 6 weeks of use. The other was a small photograph, edges soft from handling, of a woman in her 50s standing in front of a bakery in a city that was not on this plateau. He set both on the portable table that had been placed between them. "We have a tradition," he said. "When we want to understand something, we look at what it carries." Both pathkeepers looked at the items. Stillwater studied the lead panel with focused attention. Kindling Light looked at the photograph. "The woman," Kindling Light said, "she is known to you." "My mother," Voss said. "She opened that bakery with about $30 and a borrowed oven. It's still open. She hums while she works. Same song every morning. I don't know the name of it. She says she doesn't either. She made it up somewhere along the way and it just stayed." There was a silence. "Why do you carry this here?" Stillwater asked. "Because wherever I go," Voss said, "I need to remember what I'm trying to get back to." The interactions that followed over the next 3 days were unlike anything the contact protocols had anticipated, and unlike anything Voss had experienced in 12 years of professional situations, designed to be the most difficult a person could face. Stillwater was extraordinary. That was the only word. She had what Voss came to think of as a perfect mind. She could hold multiple lines of logic simultaneously, never lost the thread of an argument, and processed information with a speed and clarity that was genuinely breathtaking to witness. She knew more about human history than most historians Voss had ever met, had analyzed conflict patterns across 12 centuries of human warfare and drawn connections that no human scholar had identified. She showed him simulations of possible human futures, precise branching structures that accounted for resource depletion, population dynamics, technological development curves. She was never unkind. She was never condescending. She was simply, completely right about almost everything, and she knew it. And she did not see this as a problem because being right was the point. "Your species will exhaust this planet," she said, on the second day without any particular emphasis, the way one states a physical law. "Our models give you 140 years at current consumption trajectories." "We know," Voss said. "You continue regardless." "We're working on it." "The working is insufficient." "I know." She looked at him. "This does not distress you as much as it should." "It distresses me plenty," he said. "But I can't fix it by distressing myself in this tent. I can fix it by going home and doing what I can, which is small, and trusting that there are other people doing what they can, which is also small, and that enough small things accumulate." Stillwater was quiet for a moment. "You know this logic is inadequate." "Yes," he said, "but it's what I have." Kindling Light asked him, on the morning of the second day, what music his mother hummed. He tried to describe it, a simple thing, mostly 4 notes arranged and rearranged, slow and unhurried, the kind of tune that belonged to early mornings and flour-dusted counters and the sound of an oven heat. He found himself humming it without thinking about it, and when he realized what he was doing he stopped, slightly embarrassed. "Continue," Kindling Light said. He looked at her. "Please," she said. He hummed it, the whole small, unhurried thing. They're in the contact facility on an Azerbaijani plateau with 2 beings from another star system, and a UN radio operator pretending very hard not to be listening. When he finished, Kindling Light did the warm tilt thing again with her head. "It is not complete," she said. "It doesn't have an ending. My mother says endings make a song smaller. The song is supposed to keep going." "In your culture," Kindling Light said, "this is a common principle." He thought about it more than we admit. She leaned forward slightly. "Tell me about your bakery, not your mother's bakery, your bakery, the place you return to." He almost said he didn't have one. Then he stopped and thought about it honestly and said, "A bar in Bogota, terrible coffee, good beer, 3 tables, a jukebox that only works sometimes. The owner knows me by name. He keeps a bottle behind the bar with my name on a piece of tape, because I come back every couple of years and I drink exactly half of it, and I leave the rest for the next visit. You do not finish the bottle. The bottle not being finished is part of the reason to come back. Kindling Light was very still for a moment. This is the thing, she said quietly, almost to herself. This is it. On the third day, Arch informed Voss that the interaction period would end at sunset, and that he would be asked to make his indication at that time. He spent the afternoon thinking. Not strategically. He was not capable of approaching this strategically, which he suspected was exactly the point. He thought about what Tran had said, that whatever he chose needed to come from something true. He thought about Stillwater's perfect clarity, her terrifying accuracy, the way she had described humanity's failures with the flat compassion of a doctor reading a diagnosis. He thought about how much she was right and how little comfort it brought. He thought about Kindling Light asking him to keep humming. He thought about the bar in Bogota, the bottle with his name on it, half empty by design. He thought about his mother's song that had no ending because endings made things smaller. He thought about the morning he had walked toward the ships and why he had done it. It had not been courage, not precisely. It had been something more stubborn and less noble, a refusal to let fear be the last thing that defined the moment, a preference for working the problem. A decision, barely conscious, that whatever was out there under those lights was better engaged with than avoided. At 1847 local time, as the sun dropped behind the western ridge, and the sky turned the particular bronze of high summer evenings in the Caucasus, Dario Voss sat across from both pathkeepers one final time and said what he had to say. "I understand what you're asking me to choose," he said, "and I want to be honest about something first because I think you'll know if I'm not." Both of them were watching him. "Stillwater," he said, "you might be the most impressive thing I've ever encountered, and I don't mean your species, I mean you specifically. You see everything clearly. You're right about most of it. The things you described about where we're headed, the failures, the trajectories, they're accurate, and they should terrify anyone paying attention." He paused. "But the reason they don't finish me off is the reason I can't choose you as what we most truly are." Stillwater inclined her head, not in offense, more like recognition. "Kindling Light," he said, "you asked me about a bar in Bogota. You asked me about a song that doesn't end. You kept the photograph of my mother's bakery in your field of attention for a long time." He stopped. "You weren't cataloging. You were curious. You wanted to understand what it felt like from the inside, not what it measured as from the outside." Kindling Light did not speak. She waited. "The thing about humans," Voss said slowly, working it out as he spoke, the way he always worked the hardest problems aloud, imprecisely, inch by inch, is that we are exactly as broken as your models show. We are everything Stillwater described. We exhaust things. We hurt each other. We make the same errors in century after century, and we have no good excuse for it." He turned the worn lead panel over in his hands. "But the thing that I don't think your taxonomy accounts for is this. We know the song is supposed to keep going. We keep the bottle half empty on purpose. We carry photographs of where we come from into the worst places we go, not because it helps, rationally, but because we refuse to be the kind of thing that forgets." The sun was fully below the ridge. The bronze sky was going purple. "That's not greatness," he said. "It's not clean and it's not efficient and it's going to keep causing us problems until the end of whatever we've got. But it's ours. It's what we are at the bottom of it." He set down the lead panel. "So I choose curiosity. I choose the one who wanted to know what it felt like from the inside, because that's what we do even when it costs us. We keep wanting to understand." He looked at Kindling Light. "That's my indication." The silence lasted exactly as long as it needed to. Then Kindling Light said, in translated English that had more inflection in it than the interface was supposed to carry, "We know." The reclassification took the Vaillant Council, which was not called a council, but which functioned as 47 hours to complete. During that time, the ships remained on the plateau, stationary and unhurried, while on the other side of the world, the United Nations Security Council had 17 emergency sessions and issued 4 contradictory position statements and one frankly embarrassing press release that everyone subsequently pretended had not happened. Captain Tran spent the 47 hours doing what she did best, which was preparing for every possible outcome, and also drinking ginger tea because she was finally past the worst of the morning sickness. She had told Voss, sometime around hour 30, that she planned to name the baby after him if it was a boy. He had told her that Dario was a terrible name for a child born in this decade. She had told him she was using his last name. He had told her Voss wasn't much better. They had argued about it for 20 minutes, and it was the most normal conversation either of them had had in 2 months. When Arch emerged with the reclassification, it was morning again, which felt appropriate. "The classification is resolved," Arch said. "Your species is designated threshold carrying. This is the first designation of this type in the Vailn catalog." Tran looked up from her notes. "What does it mean?" "It means," Arch said, "that your species is understood to exist permanently at the boundary between what you are and what you choose to be. That this tension is not a flaw in your nature but the engine of it." The flat synthesized voice paused. "It means we will not treat you as a known quantity because you are not one. It means we will not avoid you, because avoidance of a threshold-carrying species is the same as watching a fire from outside a building and deciding it is not your concern." Another pause. "It means we consider you kin." Voss, standing to one side with his coffee flask, said nothing for a moment. "Then, and what does that mean practically?" Arch made a gesture that the human contact team had come to understand as something between a shrug and the acknowledgement of complexity. "It means a very long conversation," Arch said, "the kind with no set ending." Voss thought about his mother's song. "We're good at those," he said. They left on a Sunday morning, all 3 ships, ascending through the cloud layer with the same patient silence with which they had arrived. By the time the sun was fully up, the plateau was empty except for the contact facility, the trampled grass, and approximately 400 soldiers who were standing outside their vehicles looking at a sky that was just a sky again. Voss stood at the edge of the facility and watched the last blue-green light fade above the clouds. Kindling Light had said something to him in the final minutes before she reboarded. She had stood at the top of the ramp and turned back, and the morning light had caught the amber and copper of her in a way that made her look briefly, almost familiar. The way some things are familiar that you have never seen before. The way a song you heard once in a bar at the other end of the world comes back to you in a dream. She had said, "The bottle on the shelf in Bogota." He had said, "What about it?" She had said, "Finish it, leave a new one." He had not understood immediately. And then he had. "You don't keep the half-empty bottle because of the past. You keep it because of the next time." He stood on the plateau for a long time after the ships were gone, with the cold morning air coming off the ridgeline and the grass moving in a wind that had nothing alien in it. Just weather, just the ordinary world turning at its ordinary speed. Then he put his flask in his jacket pocket and went to find Captain Tran, because there were reports to file and protocols to revise, and a species classification to explain to a Security Council that was going to have a great deal of difficulty with the word kin. He hummed as he walked, 4 notes arranged and rearranged, no ending. The ordinary world, doing what the ordinary world does, going on imperfectly, stubbornly, with its whole heart. It was, he thought, enough. It was more than enough. It was, improbably and against all available evidence, exactly what they were. 6 months later, a small package arrived at the forward operations base outside Baku that had been established as the permanent human-Vailn liaison site. It was addressed, in careful handwritten English that showed evidence of significant practice, to Sergeant First Class Dario Voss. Inside was a device approximately the size and weight of a hardback book, made of a material that registered as no known alloy in the base laboratory's analysis, and pulsed with the faintest possible blue-green light, so faint you could only see it in a dark room. There was a note attached, 3 words long. The conversation continues. Voss took the device to his billet. He set it on the shelf next to the photograph of his mother's bakery. In the darkness before he fell asleep, the faint pulse of it was almost companionable, a slow, patient light, unhurried, not going anywhere. He lay on his back and listened to the ordinary silence of a base at night. Distant generators, wind against the prefab walls, somebody 2 rooms over playing music too loud. Human sounds, the specific, irreplaceable texture of a species that was loud and wasteful and occasionally magnificent, that hummed songs without endings and kept bottles half empty, and walked toward things that frightened it because the alternative was worse. He thought about Kindling Light's question, what does it feel like from the inside? It feels, he thought, like this, exactly like this. Messy and specific and stubborn, and going on. He closed his eyes. The small light pulsed in the dark. The conversation continued.